The alarm screamed across the steel deck like a banshee's wail, cutting through the acrid smoke that still rose from the burning destroyer 2,000 yards to starboard. I spun the twin 40mm Bofors gun toward the eastern horizon, my hands slick with sweat inside leather gloves, searching the blinding late afternoon sun for death incarnate. The USS Laffey DD-724 had already taken 4 kamikaze hits that morning, and somehow we were still afloat, still fighting. But we all knew, that the next one might be our last. Then I saw him. A black speck against the blazing orange disk of the sun, growing larger by the second. A Mitsubishi A6M Zero, its engine howling like a demon as it dove straight for our port side. My finger found the trigger, and I began to pray. My name is Seaman First Class Tommy Morrison, and I'm 20 years old. 3 months ago, I was loading ammunition at the Norfolk Navy Yard in Virginia, dreaming of the day I'd get to see and show the Japs what American firepower could do. Now, on this blood-soaked morning of May 28, 1945, off the coast of Okinawa, I wished I was back home in Nebraska, helping my father plant corn. The Pacific had been boiling with death for 3 months. Operation Iceberg, the invasion of Okinawa, had begun on April 1st, and the Japanese had responded with the largest kamikaze offensive in history. They called it Operation Kikusui, the floating chrysanthemum, and it was designed to turn the waters around Okinawa into a graveyard of American steel. I'd been aboard the Laffey since February, part of a crew of 336 men under the command of Lieutenant Commander F. Julian Becton. The Laffey was a Sumner-class destroyer, 376 feet of sleek gray death bristling with radar, sonar, and enough firepower to level a city block. We carried 5 5-inch guns, 12 40mm Bofors cannons, and 11 20mm Oerlikon guns. Every surface that could mount a weapon had been fitted with one. We were what the Navy called a floating porcupine, designed to throw up a wall of lead that nothing could penetrate. But the Kamikaze weren't nothing. They were human beings, Japanese pilots who had sworn to die for their emperor, and they kept coming no matter how many we shot down. The morning of May 28th had started quietly. We were on Picket Station No. 1, about 30 miles north of Okinawa, serving as an early warning post for the invasion fleet. The Laffey and her sister ship, the Mekong, were alone on a calm sea that stretched endlessly in every direction. The sun had just climbed above the horizon, painting through water gold and pink, when our radar operator's voice crackled over the intercom. "Captain, we've got multiple bogies inbound, bearing 090, distance 40 miles and closing fast." Commander Becton's voice came back steady and calm. "General quarters. All hands to battle stations. This is not a drill." The klaxon alarm echoed through every compartment of the ship, and 336 men moved with practiced precision to their combat positions. I ran to my station at gun mount 43, one of the twin 40mm Bofors guns mounted amidships on the port side. My gun captain was gunner's mate 2nd class Pete Delevsky, a tough Polish kid from Detroit who'd been fighting in the Pacific since Guadalcanal. "Load high explosive," Pete shouted over the noise of men running and equipment clanging. "Proximity fuse. These bastards are coming in low and fast." I fed the 4-round clips into the gun's loading mechanism, the brass shells cold against my sweating palms. Each 40mm round weighed 2 pounds and could punch through an inch of steel at 1,000 yards. When it exploded, it sent hundreds of steel fragments in every direction, turning the sky into a deadly metal storm. The first wave hit us at 0830 hours. 6 Nakajima B-6 Intensen torpedo bombers came screaming in from the northeast, flying barely 50 feet above the water. These weren't suicide attacks. They were conventional torpedo runs designed to cripple us before the Kamikaze arrived. But Commander Becton had been fighting Japanese aircraft for 3 years, and he knew their tactics. "All ahead flank. Hard left rudder," he shouted from the bridge. The Laffey heeled over in a tight turn, her engine screaming as she built up to 35 knots. White water boiled up from her stern as her 4 screws bit deep into the sea. The torpedo bombers had to fly straight and level to launch their fish, which gave our gunners precious seconds to track them. Target bearing 270. Pete yelled. Range 800 yards. Commence firing. I squeezed the triggers, and the twin Bofors guns erupted in a steady thump, 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 thump that I felt in my bones. Bright orange tracers streaked across the water toward the lead bomber, and I watched through the gun sight as our shells bracketed the aircraft. The first Tenzin suddenly belched black smoke and cartwheeled into the sea, its torpedo exploding in a towering column of water and flame. All around us, the Laffey's guns were firing. The 5-inch guns were throwing up a curtain of airburst shells, each one exploding in a black puff that sent steel fragments screaming through the air. The 20mm Oerlikons were chattering like angry typewriters, their tracers weaving deadly patterns across the sky. The noise was incredible, a continuous roar of explosions and gunfire that made it impossible to think. 2 more torpedo bombers went down in flames before they could launch, but 3 got their fish in the water. I watched the white wakes of the torpedoes racing toward us at 40 knots, and for a moment I thought we were finished. But Commander Becton was a magician at ship handling. He threw the Laffey into a series of sharp turns that made the destroyer dance across the water like a ballerina, and all 3 torpedoes passed harmlessly astern. The last 2 Tenzins tried to strafe us as they pulled out of their attack, but our anti-aircraft fire was too heavy. One exploded in midair, hit by a 5-inch shell. The other limped away toward the north, trailing smoke and fuel. Cease fire. Cease fire. Pete shouted. Check your guns and reload. I opened the breech of the Bofors and cleared a jammed shell, then fed in fresh ammunition. My ears were ringing, and the smell of cordite and hot metal filled my nostrils. Around me, other gun crews were doing the same thing, checking equipment, replacing damaged components, preparing for the next attack. It came 20 minutes later. Multiple bogies inbound from the west. The radar operator reported. High speed, low altitude. Looks like fighters. This time it was 8 Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters, the most dangerous aircraft in the Japanese inventory. But these weren't carrying bumps or torpedoes. They were Kamikaze, human-guided missiles loaded with explosives and fuel, piloted by men who had already written their death poems and said goodbye to their families. The first Zero came straight at us from the starboard bow, its engine screaming at full power. I could see the pilot clearly through my gun sight, a young man about my own age, his face hidden behind flight goggles, his hands steady on the controls. He was diving from about 3,000 feet, building up speed for his final plunge into our ship. Every gun on the Laffey opened fire at once. The sky filled with tracers and explosive shells, and the Zero flew straight through it all. I watched our 40mm rounds hitting the aircraft, saw pieces of wing and fuselage flying off, but the pilot held his course. At the last second, he pulled up slightly and smashed into our number 1 5-inch gun mount. The explosion knocked me flat on my back. A wall of orange flame rolled across the forward part of the ship, and chunks of twisted metal rained down on the deck. When I scrambled back to my feet, gun mount 51 was gone, just a smoking crater where 12 men had been standing 30 seconds before. But there were 7 more Zeros coming. The second Kamikaze tried to hit us amidships, diving from the port side. Pete was screaming orders, and I was firing as fast as I could work the triggers, sending stream after stream of 40mm shells into the diving aircraft. This time we got lucky. Our tracers walked right up the Zero's fuselage and into the engine, and the plane exploded in a ball of fire just 200 yards away. Burning wreckage splashed into the sea, missing our port rail by 50 feet. The third Zero came in low from the stern, trying to hit our engine room. The 20mm gunners caught him early, and their concentrated fire tore off one wing. The aircraft cartwheeled into the water, just short of our fantail, its bomb exploding underwater and lifting our stern clear out of the sea. For a moment I thought the ship was going to break in half, but the Laffey was tough. She settled back into the water with a tremendous splash, her screws still turning. Two more Kamikaze made simultaneous attacks from opposite sides. I swung my gun toward the one coming from port, another Zero, its pilot hunched over the controls, flying so low that his prop wash was kicking up spray from the wave tops. I could see the meatball insignia on his wings, the flash of his propeller as it caught the sunlight. At 500 yards, I opened fire. The twin Bofors guns bucked and roared, sending a stream of high-explosive shells racing toward the diving Zero. My first burst went low, the tracers disappearing into the water just ahead of the aircraft. I raised the gun muzzle slightly and fired again, and this time I saw the shells impacting on the Zero's engine cowling. The Japanese fighter shuddered and began to smoke, but the pilot didn't waver. He was committed to his attack, and nothing was going to stop him. At 200 yards, his aircraft was a flying wreck, holes torn in the wings, smoke pouring from the engine, pieces of fuselage streaming behind like confetti. But he held his course. At 100 yards, our 5-inch guns couldn't depress low enough to hit him. The 20mm Oerlikons were blazing away, their tracers forming bright streams of light that converged on the diving Zero. I kept firing my Bofors, the shells exploding all around the aircraft, but somehow missing the vital spots. At 50 yards, I could see the pilot's face clearly. He was young, maybe younger than me, and there was no fear in his expression, only a terrible determination. His lips were moving, probably reciting a prayer or a poem. In that instant, despite everything, I felt sorry for him. Then Pete grabbed my shoulder and yanked me away from the gun. The Zero smashed into the deck just 20 feet from our gun mount, its 500-pound bomb exploding with a flash that turned the world white. The blast wave picked me up and threw me against a bulkhead, and for a moment I couldn't see or hear anything. When my vision cleared, I was lying on my back, staring up at a sky full of black smoke and falling debris. Pete was beside me, blood running down his face from a cut on his forehead. "You okay, kid?" he shouted, though his voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. I tried to answer, but no sound came out. My ears were ringing so loud I couldn't hear my own voice. Pete helped me to my feet, and I looked around at what was left of our gun mount. The twin Bofors was twisted into scrap metal, its barrels bent at impossible angles. The deck plating was peeled back like the lid of a sardine can, and there was a hole big enough to drive a truck through. But we were alive, and the Laffey was still fighting. All around us, the battle continued. The remaining Kamikaze were pressing their attacks with suicidal determination, and our surviving guns were throwing up everything they had. I saw another Zero diving on gun mount 52 and watched as Seaman Jones, the gun captain, stood his ground until the last second, firing his 20mm Oerlikon until the Kamikaze was less than 100 feet away. At the last instant, the Zero's engine quit, probably hit by Jones' fire, and the aircraft fell short, crashing into the sea just off our starboard beam. Another Kamikaze tried to hit the bridge, where Commander Becton was still coolly directing the ship's defense. The 5-inch guns caught this one early, and their proximity fused shell-struck the Zero into confetti before it could complete its dive. Burning pieces of aircraft scattered across the water like deadly rain. By 0930, the attack was over. 8 Kamikaze had tried to sink the Laffey, and we had shot down 7 of them. The 8th had gotten through, but his bomb had exploded in a non-vital area, and the damage control teams were already working to contain the fires and flooding. But the cost had been terrible. 23 men were dead, and 47 more were wounded. Gun mount 51 was completely destroyed, and 2 of our 5-inch guns were damaged beyond repair. The forward part of the ship looked like it had been hit by a tornado, with twisted metal and broken equipment scattered everywhere. Pete and I were assigned to help with damage control, and for the next hour we worked alongside the ship's carpenters and electricians, shoring up bulkheads and rerouting electrical cables. The smell of smoke and death was everywhere, and I kept thinking about the young Japanese pilot I had seen in that last instant before his Zero hit the deck. He had been brave, I had to admit that. Stupid and wasteful, but brave. At 1100 hours, just as we thought the worst was over, the radar picked up another contact. Single bogey, bearing 180, distance 20 miles in closing, the operator reported. High speed, low altitude. This time there was no time for a general quarters alarm. The remaining gun crew scrambled to their positions, and I found myself manning a 20mm Oerlikon on the starboard side, since our Bofors was out of action. The Oerlikon was a smaller weapon, only 20mm compared to the Bofors 40, but it was faster firing and more accurate at short range. The single bogey turned out to be another Zero, probably a straggler from the morning's attack who had been hiding in the clouds, waiting for his chance. He came in from the south, flying barely 50 feet above the water, his engine at full throttle. This pilot was different from the others. Instead of diving from altitude, he was making a low-level approach, hoping to get under our radar and catch us by surprise. It was a smart tactic, but Commander Becton had been fighting Japanese aircraft since Pearl Harbor, and he knew all their tricks. All guns, target bearing 180, he shouted from the bridge. Range decreasing rapidly. Commence firing when ready. I gripped the handles of the Oerlikon and sighted down the barrel at the approaching Zero. At 2,000 yards, it was just a speck against the horizon. At 1,000 yards, I could make out its distinctive silhouette, the long nose, the greenhouse canopy, the fixed landing gear that marked it as an older model A6M2. At 800 yards, I opened fire. The 20mm cannon had a distinctive sound, a rapid bang 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 that was different from the deeper roar of the larger guns. Each shell was about the size of a beer bottle, and when it hit, it could punch through an inch of armor plate. I walked my tracers toward the Zero, adjusting my aim as the aircraft grew larger in my sight. The first burst went wide, the tracers disappearing into the sea ahead of the diving Kamikaze. I corrected my aim and fired again, and this time I saw my shell sparking off the Zero's wing root. The aircraft shuddered slightly but held its course. All around me, the Laffey's remaining guns were firing. The damaged 5-inch guns were throwing up proximity-fused shells that exploded in black puffs ahead of the Zero. The other 20mm guns were chattering away, their tracers forming a deadly web of fire. But the Japanese pilot kept coming, flying straight and level toward our starboard side. At 400 yards, I could see his face through the canopy. Like the others, he was young, probably no more than 22 or 23. His flight helmet was leather, and I could see the white hachimaki headband tied around it, the rising sun symbol painted on his forehead. His eyes were fixed straight ahead, focused on the point where he intended to crash. At 200 yards, my shells were hitting the Zero regularly, tearing pieces off the wings and fuselage. Black smoke was pouring from the engine, and I could see flames starting to lick back from the cowling. But the pilot's hands were steady on the controls, and the aircraft's nose never wavered from its target. At 100 yards, I knew we were in trouble. The Zero was too close, and there wasn't enough time to knock it down before it reached the ship. I kept firing, sending stream after stream of 20mm shells into the diving aircraft, but it wasn't enough. Then, at the last possible second, something extraordinary happened. Lieutenant William Kearns, the Laffey's gunnery officer, had been standing on the bridge directing our fire. As the Zero closed to 50 yards, Kearns grabbed a Thompson submachine gun from one of the bridge lookouts and opened fire on the Kamikaze with 45 caliber bullets. It was a desperate, almost ridiculous gesture, trying to stop a diving fighter plane with a submachine gun. But sometimes desperate gestures work. One of Kearns' bullets smashed through the Zero's canopy and hit the pilot in the head, killing him instantly. The Zero, now pilotless, veered sharply to the right, and crashed into the sea just 20 yards from our hull. Its bomb exploded underwater, sending up a towering column of water that drenched everyone on the starboard side. But the ship was undamaged. For a moment, there was absolute silence. Then somebody started cheering, and the sound spread throughout the ship. We had survived. Against all odds, the Laffey was still afloat, and we were still alive. But the celebration was short-lived. As the adrenaline wore off, the full scope of our losses became clear. 23 men dead, 47 wounded, and the ship badly damaged. We had fought off 16 separate kamikaze attacks in the space of 90 minutes, probably a record for any single ship in the entire war. The rest of that day passed in a blur of damage control and medical treatment. The wounded were evacuated by helicopter to hospital ships, and the dead were wrapped in canvas and prepared for burial at sea. The ship's carpenters worked around the clock to patch holes and shore up damaged bulkheads, while the electricians restored power to vital systems. As evening fell, I found myself standing alone on the fantail, looking out at the calm sea that surrounded us. The sun was setting in the west, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded me of the flames I had seen that morning. In the distance, I could see the lights of other ships in the fleet, all of them fighting the same war, all of them carrying young men like me who were a long way from home. I thought about the Japanese pilots I had seen that day, the determination in their eyes, the steadiness of their hands on the controls, the way they had flown straight into our guns without flinching. They had been the enemy, and I had killed some of them, but I couldn't hate them. They had been doing their duty, just as I had been doing mine. The war would end 3 months later, after the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The USS Laffey would survive to sail home, carrying her scars and her memories. Many of us would spend the rest of our lives trying to forget what we had seen and done in those terrible 90 minutes off Okinawa. But we would never forget the lesson we learned that day, that courage and determination are not the exclusive property of any one nation or people. The Japanese pilots who died trying to sink our ship were as brave as any men who ever lived. They were wrong, terribly, tragically wrong, but they were brave. And sometimes, in the small hours of the night when sleep won't come, I still see that young pilot's face in the instant before his Zero hit our deck. I see his lips moving in prayer, his hands steady on the controls, his eyes fixed on eternity. He was my enemy, but he was also my brother, another young man caught up in a war that none of us had made, doing what he thought was right. That's the thing about war that they don't tell you in the movies. It's not just about heroes and villains, good guys and bad guys. It's about young men dying far from home, each one convinced that his cause is just, each one carrying someone's hopes and dreams into the fire. The kamikaze attacks on the American fleet off Okinawa cost the Japanese nearly 4,000 aircraft and pilots. The Americans lost 36 ships sunk and 368 damaged, with casualties of over 12,000 killed and wounded. It was one of the bloodiest naval campaigns in history, and it convinced the American leadership that an invasion of Japan itself would be too costly to contemplate. In the end, the atomic bombs that ended the war were dropped partly because of what happened in the waters around Okinawa. The Kamikaze had shown that the Japanese were willing to fight to the death, and that the cost of conquest would be measured in hundreds of thousands of lives. I survived the war and came home to Nebraska, where I married my high school sweetheart and raised 4 children. I worked for the railroad for 37 years, and I never talked much about what happened aboard the Laffey that day in May of 1945. But I never forgot it either. Every Memorial Day, I visit the cemetery where some of my shipmates are buried, and I remember the 23 men who died defending our ship. They were heroes, every one of them, and they deserve to be remembered. But I also remember the young Japanese pilot who flew his Zero into our gun mount, and the others who died trying to sink us that day. They were heroes too, in their own way, and their sacrifice deserves to be acknowledged, even by their former enemies. War is hell, as General Sherman said, but sometimes it brings out the best in men as well as the worst. On both sides of that terrible conflict, young men showed courage and devotion that would have made their ancestors proud. They fought and died for their countries, their families, and their beliefs, and they deserve to be honored for that, regardless of which flag they served under. The USS Laffey is now a museum ship in Charleston, South Carolina, where visitors can walk her decks and see the battle damage that was never fully repaired. If you ever go there, take a memento stand where Gun Mount 43 used to be, and remember the men who served there. Remember the Americans who died defending their ship, and remember the Japanese who died attacking it. Remember them all, because they were all heroes in their own way, and their sacrifice made us who we are today. The war ended, but the memories never fade. And maybe that's the way it should be.